Hello guys, welcome back to another video, and this is going to be part 2 of my Cards Basic Training Guide. So, I am still in the process of working on some more general tips and tricks, guides to different abilities, card types, etc. However, I've seen a lot of questions about how to play the deck that I showed off at the end of my part 1 guide. So, this US-German sort of mid-range style deck that is built around the front line is the deck that you can build exclusively with cards that you unlock by rank 12 on every nation. Although actually specifically you only need rank 12 on Germany and on US. And this is the deck that I recommended to play on ladder while learning the game. So I thought I would just show off how you should be trying to play the deck. How to handle different matchups, how to mulligan what cards you should be looking for, and then maybe at the end of the video talk about some of the cards that you can build towards once you start getting some more wild cards, where you can create more cards to put into this deck. So, before we get into this, I did want to say that I actually have heard from several people that they have used this deck, or variations upon this deck as they have added in new cards they got, to hit Field Marshal within their first month. So there's several different people who have hit Field Marshal, which is the highest rank you can achieve in the game. That's what is going to be getting you your the 4-card packs and a gold elite at the end of each month, if you can do that. So absolutely is possible, and hopefully in this guide I will teach you a thing or two to make that more achievable, especially if you don't have too much prior experience in card game format. So with that, let's get into the games, and I will teach you how to play the Cards starter deck.
What a performance there by J-King.
J-King, full plot armor.
J-King is pushing himself into the ranks of the legend.
J-King is our world champion! J-King 7! What? The back-to-back Cards world champion!
Alright, so our first opponent is German, and we are starting first. So, as a general rule, you want to get cards that are cheap that you can play at the beginning of the game. Now, I think the most expensive card in our deck costs 6. So we don't have to worry about that too much. Now, there's some cards, like the Panzer 35T, which is going to be very useful if we have an early infantry, which we don't. However, just having a blitz tank, very good. 5th infantry, very solid card to keep, especially going first. Does come out on 2, but this is just a solid body. You can move to the front line early. And I'm going to keep a 5th Rangers, because this is a very, very powerful card, just in general. But if you play this on turn 4 and pick the 0 operation option, then you have a 4/4 in the front line that can operate for free every turn. So it's nice to have a 1-drop, but it's definitely not important, since most of your opponents will not be playing too aggressive decks. Japan is really the main deck you have to worry about. If you see your opponent is playing a Japanese deck, there's a higher chance that they will have a lot of early 1-drops. But if you're playing against Germany, and then especially against decks like Britons or Soviets, then you can usually take things a little bit slower, especially since we are going first, which means we do have the credit advantage. We get to 2 credits first, we get to 3 credits first, etc. So, as you can see, he has played a 2-drop. This is a Whirlwind, this is a 2/3 tank. However, our 5th Infantry Regiment gets +1/+1 when it moves into the front line. And since we went first, we can move it into the front line, and now we have a 3/4, which is going to trade out very nicely with our opponent's Whirlwind. And we have 2 options. We can go for the 35T, which will have its operation cost reduced to 0, and since it has Blitz, we can attack him in the HQ for 2 damage. However, that immediately gives him a target to kill with the Whirlwind, so we will have essentially accomplished nothing. Or we can play this 22nd Infantry Regiment that we just drew. This does not have Blitz. However, the card text is, if you control the front line at the end of your turn, draw a card. So this card, if you don't have the front line, if you're trying to get the front line, this card is not particularly useful in helping you do that. It's a 2/1 infantry without any other special abilities like Blitz or Guard or anything like that. However, if you do control the front line, this card can snowball out of control very, very quickly. So it's already given us an immediate card draw. However, if the opponent is not unable to remove it, then it's going to be capable of giving us a lot more card draw moving forward. So our opponent has buffed his Whirlwind up to a 3/4 as well, and hit into our 5th Infantry. So at this point, there's a pretty good possibility we might lose the front line. However, we have a few different ways to get around that. So there's 3 different lines we can go for on this turn. We can play a 5th Rangers and move it up as a 4/4 blitz to the front line, and that would be perfectly reasonable, because 4/4 would have to trade with both of his units on board, and we maintain the front line. The other option would be to play Sherman and draw immediately. Sherman draws 2 cards if you control the front line with a US unit. Or we can play 35T and Greyhound and get 2 different units up to the front line, and that way it's harder for him to take it since there is a greater total number of units. And all 3 of these lines would be perfectly reasonable. I am going to go for the line where we will just trade out the 35T and take the front line with 2 different units. And this is because, 1, we are solidifying the front line longer for 22nd Infantry. This card's now drawn as twice, which has more than made up for the cost of playing it. And it's very likely that we will be able to draw with Sherman in the future. Now, this is a pretty important tip with this deck, is Sherman is your main card draw engine. However, you do not need to play Sherman the second you can. Sherman is definitely not a card that you have to play it as quickly as possible. You should only play it if you either need the card draw immediately, like you might be low on cards, or your opponent has a powerful unit that you're looking for a piece of removal to answer, or if you are about to lose the front line. This is going to be the last opportunity for you to draw with Sherman. However, looking at the current board state, he only has 1 unit on board. It's not that big, and we have the 5th Rangers, which is an American unit with Blitz, and we have a couple of other American units that we can play out. So there's not a rush to play Sherman here. In fact, here, we could even take it a little bit slowly and play out a 5th Infantry, and then buff up our Greyhound to make it harder for the opponent to remove. And this is because even if the opponent is able to take the front line, even if they're able to remove the Greyhound and get a unit up into the front line, we can just play the 5th Rangers, which a 4/4 Blitz should be able to remove anything he gets to the front line, and then we simply take back the front line with control of these slow-moving 5th Infantry Regiment, 17th Infantry Regiment, and we are now up to 3 cards drawn off of the 22nd. Our opponent is going to remove the 17th. They most likely should have removed the 22nd. That is probably a mistake on their part. And now we see they have their own 22nd Infantry, except they're not going to be drawing cards off of this because we control the front line. And with this, we can get another 5th Infantry up. This is another 3/4 in the front line. Here we could draw with Sherman. We could simply play a We Can Do It to buff the health of these units, and that is the play I'm leaning towards. Or we could get up another 5th Infantry. We can play 2nd California. Won't be able to get to the front line yet. But again, we can take things pretty slowly. I'm just going to maintain control of the front line, get the health up on this 22nd Infantry to make it harder for him to remove, and this has now drawn 4 cards. So again, Sherman is the main card draw in this deck. However, the 22nd Infantry does offer quite a substantial card draw if you are able to control the board like so. And this is very much the point of the deck. The way you are supposed to play this deck is exactly how I'm hopefully demonstrating to you, which is just very, very slowly take the front line, take valuable trades when you can, and if you have control of the front line, you will eventually lead your opponent into situations like this, where they are forced to play out all of their units into the support line to try to deal with your front line, and then you simply play a card like Stars and Stripes, which is going to remove all of these units, and we can even move up the 22nd Infantry now, because with 2 Shermans in hand, we have plenty of draw. This is drawn as 5 cards now, so we can move it up, and it can start even threatening our opponent's HQ. Sunstrike is a very powerful way of getting rid of that card. And actually, if you notice, we no longer have a US unit in the front line, however. 5th Rangers has Blitz, 2nd California has Blitz, Greyhound has Blitz, so we're not really too worried. Now, we see our opponent has passed with 5 countermeasures, with 5 credits. There is a number of countermeasures that he could be holding up, so we will play out the lowest the weakest unit that we have, we will push it up. So now we know that there can't be any countermeasures that trigger off of deployment or any countermeasures that trigger off of taking the front line. So that means we are free to play out a second California. We could play out an M4A1. We could play out an M4 Sherman. There's a pretty big number of things we can do. I'm going to play out the second California just because it is going to be quite difficult for our opponent to get rid of. And if they are holding up a card such as Entrapment, which is a 5-credit countermeasure that destroys a unit when it attacks, well, we'll simply force them to spend 5 credits to hold that up a second time. So you see, the M4 Sherman and the 5th Rangers are easily the two of the most powerful cheap cards in the game, and they are certainly the cards that this deck is built around, but we have been able to hold onto the front line and just dominate this game without even ever having to play them. These are certainly, if our opponent had had better cards, a better hand, we had had a weaker opener, these cards would be very useful as comeback tools. However, in the current situation, we are simply just dominating the board, forcing our opponent to play out their cards inefficiently, and now we get to take some pretty valuable trades. So we will likely kill this with our second California, since the second California's effect is combat damage dealt to this unit is reduced to 1, meaning it can only take 1 damage at a time when fighting other units. So in the meantime, we will play out a M4A1. We will play out a 17th to buff up this 22nd. We will remove the Apache. And unfortunately, our opponent did have a countermeasure, the Scatter Tactics, which reduces the attack of units on board by 2 until end of turn, meaning that I was forced to hit in with the 22nd Infantry. But that's not too big of a deal. And here, our opponent, they're able to get some value. They've finally removed the 22nd Infantry that was played on turn 3. And played on turn 3, it's drawn a card every turn since, so I believe that 22nd Infantry drew us 6 cards over the course of this game, which is just, I mean, incredibly powerful. And here we're actually quite close to just being able to win the game, with Bolster, which will make this M4A1 a 6/5, plus the 6 damage already in the front line. We're actually, and Greyhound, we're actually only 2 damage off lethal. However, again, we can still take this game very, very slowly. We can simply remove this with the California. We can play with Bolster. And we could even draw with the M4 Sherman. However, I'm going to push a 5th Rangers into the front line and just set up more damage. So, again, we could have put our opponent to 2 health, and that would have been fine. However, it's perfectly reasonable to just leave our opponent at slightly more health in favor of a better board position, because if our opponent is going to have any sort of combination of orders and guard units or healing to deal with our board, we would rather have a board like this. Since we can now play around a countermeasure by attacking with Greyhound first and finish off our opponent and win the game like so, frankly, in an incredibly dominant fashion. This is the power of this deck. Again, every single card in this deck you can play, you have access to after a couple hours of playing the game. So, yeah, the deck code will be in the description of this video as well. It's also in the description of the previous video. Yeah, and just keep playing games like that, and you will hit Field Marshal. But, obviously, that was just a single game. Other decks play differently. Sometimes you're going to go second, sometimes you're going to have a worse hand. So, let's jump into the next game and see what happens there. Alright, here we see our opponent is in a US deck, and actually we are going first again, which means that, once again, we have the credit advantage. However, our opponent will have the card advantage. So, assuming that this is going to be some kind of mirror match, our opponent will likely be playing some sort of mid-range style deck where they are also trying to gain control of the front line. And mirror matches like these are going to be very, very brutal games, because usually one side will get control of the front line early, and then because most of the cards in the deck are more powerful, if you control the front line, that's going to allow you to sort of snowball out of control by maintaining control of the front line and getting powerful effects like the draw card from the 22nd, draw 2 cards from the Sherman. So because of that, we are going to keep Flampanzer, and we are going to keep 2 of these cheap units to play out early to get control of the front line. Because if we have control of the front line, we will be able to do a lot from there. So we see our opponent is going to start with the 112th Infantry, and actually that is a very, very powerful option for our opponent, since this gets +2 attack for each adjacent unit, which means if we push up our 1-3 to the front line, our opponent can simply play another 1 credit card. This 112th Infantry becomes a 3-2, and is able to destroy our 463rd, and essentially go up a card. In this case, he is removing one of our cards without losing one of his cards. So that would be giving our opponent a 2-for-1, meaning that we will likely have to spend another card in the future to remove this, so we will simply not give our opponent the opportunity to do so. Now, since he moved this forward, our 463rd Battalion has the ability of it deals 1 random damage to an enemy in the same front when it attacks. So because of that, we will attack, it will deal 1 random damage, and our opponent held up in the Navy, which is a countermeasure that when an enemy attacks your unit, give her +1/+2, which means that this unit is going to stay alive, unfortunately, and not be removed by a 463rd, and because of that, we will simply play the 5th Infantry. Now, if this is the power of countermeasures, is they are hidden information until you attack. So if I knew my opponent had a copy of In the Navy, I simply could have played Flampanzer and removed it without having to attack it. However, since I did not know that, I simply went for the more efficient trade of trying to remove it with 463rd and getting down a 5th Infantry Regiment, which would be a higher tempo play, but of course countermeasures come into play. So our opponent's going to buff it up and attack face, and we simply have Flampanzer to remove this 4-5. This is the power of Flampanzer. Flampanzer destroys an enemy unit with cost 1 or less, so this is going to be very useful to fighting for control of the front line in sort of these mid-range and aggressive style games. However, we could also just trade out all 3 of these units. Now, that's not amazing. However, if you think, our opponent has spent 3 cards here. So he's spent 1 card on the unit, 1 card on the countermeasure, and 1 card on the supply shipment to buff it. So this is 3 cards, and if we attack into it with all 3 of our units to kill it, we have each spent 3 cards, and then we would even have another credit to play at 463rd. Now, obviously, removing it with Flampanzer and getting a 3-4 infantry into the front line is substantially better. However, if we did not have the Flampanzer, it wouldn't even be the end of the world. We would simply trade out with our opponent and get another unit onto the board. Alright, so our opponent here is already in a very dire situation. This is one of the risks in cards. If you spend a lot of cards to buff up a single unit, and your opponent is able to remove that unit, then it's a very easy way to get 2-for-1 or 3-for-1 in this case, where I spent a Flampanzer, a single card, to remove 3 cards worth of effects off the board, and I still have the Flampanzer. So if this Flampanzer moves up and trades with the half-track, for example, I would even be getting a 4-for-1, because I've dealt with 4 cards with my 1 card, which is still on the board. So he would then need to play a 5th card to remove the Flampanzer. So despite going first and having less cards in hand, we see, well, we still have less cards in hand, but we have 4 units up on board, so the credit advantage, the tempo advantage, you are able to generate a lot of card advantage out of that. So he actually retreated our 5th Infantry, which means we can move it into the front line a second time to gain an additional +4/+5. And we could play the M4 Sherman, however, as we saw against our opponent in the previous matchup, we played a Stars and Stripes to remove their whole support line, so there's no reason for us to flood the support line. We will simply move up and trade with our opponent's unit, and they did not have a second copy of In the Navy. That is a special. It's not a particularly popular card. So we do take a bit of a risk by attacking there, but once you learn all the countermeasures, you can understand just how risky certain moves are or are not. And as mentioned, this Flampanzer has now 4-for-1 our opponent. And just looking at this board state, it's turn 5. We're both playing very similar decks. We both have, neither of us are using any cards that are, neither of us are playing any of these huge elites. Neither of us have spent money, likely, on these decks. These are all just very free-to-play decks with very similar collections. But it's turn 6, and this game's essentially good as over. Just looking at what's happening, we have 2 second Californias in our hand. We have the M4 Sherman for extra card draw, and we are incredibly far ahead on board. So we do still want to play around countermeasures, so we will move up the 463rd first. There's no countermeasure, so we will move up the 5th Infantry. And here, we could simply play the M4 Sherman, and I think that's what I'm going to go ahead and do. We could get some more cards in our hand, get some very high value cards like We Can Do It. Dive Bombing will be very useful if he has a 2nd California of his own. And, of course, we do offer up this 463rd to be killed by the half-track without removing the half-track. However, we would simply just move up the Greyhound, so he's makes the more reasonable trade of removing our Flampanzer, and as previously mentioned, our Flampanzer just went 5 for 1. Our Flampanzer was able to remove 2 half-tracks, a supply shortage, and in the Navy, and the 112th Infantry. So our opponent plays out a Pack 38. This is simply just going to be removed, and then following that, we can even play We Can Do It to buff units. And yeah, we can just get out a big board. This We Can Do It. Cards like We Can Do It, these AoE buff effects, get more powerful the more units you have on board, which is why value trading, trying to keep as many units alive as possible, is very, very effective, because this We Can Do It, with 5 units on board, was actually a plus 18 health and draw card, which is insane. Now, obviously, if you play We Can Do It on 1 unit, it's plus 6 health, or if you play it on no units, it's just simply plus 3 health. Since it's plus 3 health for every friendly thing you have on the field, and our opponent just goes ahead and surrenders, which is pretty reasonable. There's not really a way for them to win. And again, that is just another game of very dominant fashion. So let's go up into a 3rd game and see what happens. Alright, so here we are in our 3rd match, and our opponent is playing Britain, and we are going 2nd. So, going 2nd, I'm going to keep the 109th Combat Engineers. This is just a pretty effective card, and a British deck is typically not going to be contesting you in the front line early. When you play more, you will get used to these sort of styles of play from different nations, but generally speaking, Britain is either going to be an aggressive air deck, where they play a lot of units in the support line very quickly, or they will be playing a very slow control deck. So that means we are going to have time, and going 2nd, I'm not going to keep the Sherman. We already are going to have a lot of cards, and these other cards are a bit too expensive to keep. We are going to be wanting to get 1 or 2 other cheap units to play out early, just to get a control of the front line pretty early, which is going to be valuable if they're playing an air deck or a control deck. So, this game we will see how this deck plays going 2nd. And we see our opponent actually does play an early unit, the Welsh Guards. Now, this is not a particularly good unit, so we will simply play out the 463rd, since this threatens to remove the Welsh Guards if it moves up to the front line. And if it does not move up to the front line, we can play the 109th Combat Engineers and take the front line with a 2-3. Alright. These are the style of cards that Britain has access to in the early collection. It is these very high health, low attack guard units, a lot of healing. So the game is likely going to go on for a very long time. So this is going to be a bit of a different style. The last 2 games were against players on decks with a similar style of ours, which is play out units on curve, play out some 1 drops, some 2 drops, some 3 drops, some 4 drops, and try to build up a board presence to win the game that way. This opponent is going to be playing a very, very different style of trying to slow down what your opponent is doing. So we see another Welsh Guards come out. All 3 of these units have guard. All 3 of these units are very low health or low attack infantries. So actually, he buffs the 5th Brigade, which makes it a 2-6. And here, we have a very strong option. So this combo right here, the Combat Engineers and the 35T, is one of the most powerful just 2-card combos in this deck. Because if you play Combat Engineers on turn 1, and this 35T is coming out on turn 3 rather than turn 2, but this could come out as early as turn 2, you move it, it gets 0 operation cost because the 109th is an infantry, and then you move it to the front line and it becomes a 0 operation cost 3-2 blitz tank, which is very, very powerful. So, because all of these units have guard, we can't attack the HQ, but even if they didn't have guard, we wouldn't want to attack the HQ, because again, it's very, very important to be trading with this deck, especially against control-style decks, where our opponent will likely have at least a handful of board clears in his deck, so we will take this very slow. We will remove the 2 Welsh Guards in this order, so that the 463rd ping will not hit the other Welsh Guards we are killing this turn, and now our opponent is left with 2 units on board, we still have our 2 units on board. So yes, our opponent did get 2 health, and yes, our opponent does have slightly larger units on board. However, if we look at how many cards they have in their hand versus how many cards we have in our hand, things are looking pretty good for us. Now, this is a bit of a mistake for our opponent. They should have hit the 2-2 into the 3-1 and the 2-5 into the 2-2. This means that this 5th Brigade now has 2 health rather than it could have had 3 health. So this means we could remove it with Greyhound. We could remove it with Whirlwind. However, we don't actually need to remove it at all. We can simply take the front line, get the attack buff in, and play out the 5th Infantry. So this is another important thing to learn on this deck, is you don't always have to remove everything immediately. This 5th Brigade, it's very, very slow. It's not posing a threat. It's not going to value trade with anything. It's not threatening to deal a lot of HQ damage or anything like that. This is just simply a slow infantry in the support line. So rather than spending all my credits to remove it and leave myself with a very weak front line, I'm simply going to get out this 5th Infantry, which I can now get to the front line as a 4-4, +1/+1 because of its natural card ability and +1 attack from the combat engineers. We can remove the guard, and we can get up a Whirlwind to the front line as a 3-3, and this Whirlwind is going to pin all enemy air units that he deploys until he removes it. Which means even though, yes, our opponent has one big 5-5 plane, we have 4 units on board. And actually, this is going to be a very good opportunity to see this principle in display. Our opponent played We Could Do It, which is a very powerful card. It makes sense. He is a US ally deck, so it makes sense We Can Do It is in his deck. However, since we have been trading out all of his units, he only has Spitfire on board. And since our units are just generally better, or not better, but bigger in stats, and we have been the one to control the trading, we have 4 units on board versus his 1. So despite us both playing the same card, which is We Can Do It, his We Can Do It was +6 health and a draw. Our We Can Do It is +15 health and a draw. And then we also are able to attack the HQ for 4 damage. So yes, our opponent does have a big 5-8. It is the biggest unit on the board. However, we have a lot of units. And the reason we played a We Can Do It here, rather than something like dive bombing and actually removing his Spitfire altogether, is because our opponent is likely going to be playing a card called Carpet Bombing, which I'm sure you are very familiar with if you play against any number of Britons. It is a 7 cost to deal 3 damage to all enemy units card, which is very, very powerful at removing enemy boards, which is why we simply went for the We Can Do It, to get the health of our units up. Now, our opponent has played a Churchill Mark IV, which means that this is a 2/7 heavy armor 1 guard. This guard is incredibly powerful, and if we attack into it with every single unit on the board that we have, it won't even remove it. This will only deal 6 out of the 7 necessary damage. Now, of course, there's ways to get around that. We could play 17th Infantry, we could move up and attack with the Greyhound, we could play dive bombing even. However, what we are simply going to do is move up and attack into it with the Hellcat, because the Hellcat has the ability to deal double damage against tanks, which is very, very useful at getting rid of these very high health, heavy armor tanks that you might see from a variety of different nations. And now we could set up removing the Spitfire with something like dive bombing, hit it for 4, or we could even just hit it for 4, and because we have so much health on this 5th Infantry it sticks around, we will simply attack our opponent in the HQ for another 7 damage. Now, this isn't necessarily because we are putting our opponent under a ton of pressure. It's not necessarily that we are trying to win the next turn, because actually, if we look at our hand, we can't win next turn. There's a couple of cards in our deck that we could draw to try to win next turn, but currently we can't. However, our opponent doesn't know that, and our opponent knows that we will have access to cards like Blitzkrieg in our collection if we want. So our opponent is going to have to be aware that there is a possibility I die next turn. I need to be worried about that. I need to be aware of that. I will need to trade. I will need to play more guards. I will need to not attack the HQ. And in this case, our opponent just made his Spitfire into an 8/11, which is quite terrifying, and we do not have lethal. So now is the time to play the dive bombing, and dive bombing is a very, very useful card, because it only does 1 damage, which is not a lot. However, it sets the attack to 0, which means you are able to attack into it with all of your other units, essentially at no cost. These units are not going to take damage, and here we can play out the 17th, and fully remove it. We have removed his 811 Spitfire without taking a single hit of damage to any of our units, and we will even move up the Combat Engineers. Now, normally you don't like to move up Combat Engineers. It does have Smokescreen. It's a very valuable card. However, it has been buffed up with We Can Do It, and it is just going to be an extra body in the front line that is able to attack into the HQ. It's able to do little bits of damage when trading out his board. So here we see the card advantage, despite him starting with less cards in hand. So we have spent more cards over the course of this game. The card advantage is slowly going back to his favor. However, we have 5 units on board. So this is sort of the advantage of having all of these units. And here, our opponent has played another Churchill Mark IV. Unfortunately, we do not have the Hellcat. We could play the second dive bombing to save a lot of health on our units. However, this Churchill does not actually have that much health, or sorry, that much attack, meaning that we can attack into it like so. And actually, only one of our units is now in the range to be removed by a card like Carpet Bombing. Now, we could play California, however, this would potentially set up for a Valentine to hit Whirlwind, to hit 5th Infantry. A Carpet Bomb comes down, and it removes every single unit but Combat Engineers, and we don't really want that. So we will simply move up here, attack the HQ, and yes, our opponent is left with units on the board, and yes, our opponent can still do a devastating Carpet Bombing. That will only leave us with 109th Combat Engineers. However, it means we won't also be losing California, which is the most valuable card in our hand right now. So there, our opponent has played the Carpet Bombing. So this is the card that I've been trying to play around all game, and he actually went for the 26th Engineer Regiments rather than attacking. Since this tank does have Fury, it can attack twice, and this means our units will be kept alive in time for us to draw an M4 Sherman. So this is going to be able to draw us cards, and if we look, we have once again regained a pretty massive card advantage. And we could dive bombing to trade out this Valentine. We could just trade it out normally by simply trading in the 5th Infantry and moving up a Greyhound. We could simply move up a 2nd California. There's a lot of very strong plays here. I think I am going to go for the dive bombing here just to keep some of these units sticking around. And we will move up a Greyhound. Now, he could have a 2nd Carpet Bombing. Carpet Bombing is a special, so you can run 2 of them in your deck. However, we are taking a bit of a risk, even if they do have the 2nd Carpet Bombing to remove the entire front line. We have a large hand of some of these units. And 5th Rangers, although typically played as a 4-4 the vast majority of the time, because a 4-4 zero Operation Blitz, very, very good card. At this point in the game, if we start to get run out of cards, our opponent's playing larger and larger cards, we can always just throw out the 5th Rangers as an 8-8 infantry, which threatens a ton of damage right on its own. So here, we're once again threatening quite a large amount of damage. It's not quite lethal damage yet. However, we can really do anything we want here. This Lancashire Fusiliers is quite an annoying card. So rather than worry about what this card is going to do, we are simply going to play a Strategic Bombing, which is going to deal 3 damage to all of his cards. And now we are going to trade in with the Whirlwind. So this Whirlwind has stuck around for an incredibly long amount of time, and it's finally going to trade with out a 5-6. So these are the type of trades that you should be looking for. A 3-1 into a 5-3 is a very, very good trade, and that was able to be set up by the card like Strategic Bombing to manipulate the health of your opponent's cards to set up for these very valuable trades. So the Lancashire Fusiliers, we didn't trade in the massive M4 Sherman. It's the largest unit we have on the board. We were able to simply trade out a 1 health unit instead. And here, our opponent is completely out of cards in hand. We know the last card in hand is the Naval Support, which they will probably play right now. And with that, this game has been as good as over for a while now. However, we could really do anything we want. We could play Sherman, which might be the most responsible play. However, at this point, we will simply remove our opponent's board and put up an 8/8 body. And I mean, this simply forces our opponent into a situation where they need to find an answer to this, and the answer can't involve any board clears, since board clears are not really going to remove a 9/8 5th Rangers. The 5th Brigade is actually enough to stop it, since we do not have the ability to trade it out here, but the top deck of a 35T will be enough, with the attack buff from the Combat Engineers, is able to remove this card. And this Combat Engineers, if you remember, we kept in our opening hand, and we played it on turn 1, and every single unit we have played this game has entered the front line, and every single one of those units had its attack buffed by the Combat Engineers. So that's just the power of cards like this, and that's going to end up the game once again with a huge hand. 2nd California's M4 Shermans offering a ton more value, which we didn't even need in the end, because we were able to simply outvalue our opponent by controlling the trades, and going for very smart, intelligent trades. So, with those 3 games, I hope this is giving you an idea on how you should be approaching the deck. Once again, this deck is all cards that you have access to at the beginning, so you can make this deck immediately as soon as you start the game. Just simply have to unlock the level 12 decks on US and Germany to get access to all these cards. And yeah, very, very powerful deck. You can hit Field Marshal with this deck. And again, I did talk a little bit about this in my previous video, but if you're looking for cards to improve this deck, my first recommendation would be 3 copies of 5th Rangers. There's currently only 1 in the deck. We used our 1 US wildcard to make this card. As you gain access to additional wildcards, additional US wildcards, I would strongly recommend making those 5th Rangers. So you actually see down here we have 2 currently. So 2 extra copies of 5th Rangers, and despite California being a very, very powerful card, we will remove, well, we'll start actually by removing the M4A1 and a bolster in favor of 2 5th Rangers. Very, very powerful card. Some other cards you might be looking for is a 2nd copy of Combat Engineers, a very good card, and maybe a 3rd copy of Half Track, a 2nd copy of Blitzkrieg, instead of and cards that you can take out, because obviously the deck is 40 cards. So any cards you put in, you need to take things out. If you're putting in a 2nd Blitzkrieg, you can take out a bolster. If you're putting in a 2nd Combat Engineers, you can take out a 463rd. Stuff like that. If you put in a 4th Sherman, which I would absolutely recommend, this card's a standard, you can get a 4th Sherman pretty easily. I would probably take out a California regiment. And yeah, just play this deck, and if you get any elites, the US elites in the game are not necessarily the greatest elites ever, specifically for this deck. So if you get any US elites, obviously you can just throw it into this deck, because it's fun to play around with elites. But these particular elites are very, very powerful in this deck. The 507th PIR, this is just a solid 2-cost unit that's going to be buffing the attack of all of your infantries. You can keep it in the support line, you can move it up. Very powerful card in this US mid-range style. The new 327th Pathfinders, this card recently came out. This is just a very high tempo card. It's a US infantry, deals 2 damage, it's able to get blitzed, it's able to retreat enemy units. Very, very powerful card. The C-47 Skytrain, this is going to be spawning an infinite number of cheap US infantries in your support line, so that you're able to have constant bodies, you're able to move to the support line to draw off of cards like Sherman, or to buff with cards like We Can Do It. And yeah, that is honestly, those are the main cards you should be looking for, the main elites you should be looking for to improve this deck. However, by all means, try out other decks in the game. This is not the only one, but this is simply a deck that you can rather easily hit Field Marshal with just right out the gates. So if you have any questions on how to play this deck, on cards you might want to include, feel free to ask in the comments below. This is the point of the series, is to help new players. So if you're trying to hit Field Marshal with this deck, you have any questions, feel free to ask, or there's a link to my Discord in the description. You can join there and ask myself or any of the other number of community members who are more than willing and happy to help you out. So with that, please subscribe if you haven't already. Share this video, especially if you have any friends who you have recently gotten into cards. I'm sure this will help them a lot on their road to hitting Field Marshal and filling out their collection. And with that, I will leave you.